A man in a faded delivery uniform steps out of the elevator. 10th floor? No. He is on the 48th floor. This is the executive level of the city's largest corporation. In his worn hands, he carries a simple metal lunchbox. He misreads the silver room numbers. He pushes open a heavy oak door. The massive office is completely silent. Behind the desk, a powerful female CEO sits in the shadows. Before her lies a small birthday cake. The candles have burned down to ashes. She has no guests, no calls, no family. She looks up, her eyes red. Did you actually remember my birthday? Jacob Miller was 39 years old, but his hands looked 10 years older. They were calloused, rough, and stained with faint traces of motor oil. Today, those hands held a dented metal lunchbox. He wore a navy blue delivery jacket that had seen better days, the zipper slightly stuck near the collar. 5 years ago, Jacob was a senior mechanical engineer. He had a promising career, a bright future, and a wife who filled their home with laughter. But life can change in a single heartbeat. His wife, Sarah, was diagnosed with aggressive cancer. Jacob fought beside her, spending every dime of their savings on treatments. When she passed away, she left him with a broken heart and their beautiful 3-year-old daughter, Emma. Emma was his entire world. But Emma was born with a delicate heart condition. She required regular specialist checkups, expensive medications, and a calm, stable environment. Jacob made a choice that shocked his former colleagues. He resigned from his high-stress engineering job. He needed flexibility. He needed to be able to drop everything and run to Emma's school if her breathing became shallow. So, Jacob became a part-time delivery driver. He traded his corporate salary for time. Today was a particularly hard day. The rent was overdue. The pharmacy bill had doubled. Yet, as Jacob prepared to leave their small, cramped apartment that morning, 8-year-old Emma had run to him. She handed him his lunchbox. On top of the metal lid, she had taped a small, crumpled piece of yellow paper. Written in messy, childlike handwriting was a note. "I am so proud of you, Daddy. Eat all your carrots." Jacob smiled as he remembered that note. He clutched the lunchbox tightly as he navigated the bustling corridors of the Sterling Tower. He had been hired to hand-deliver a set of confidential blueprint documents to the legal department on the 4th floor. But the Sterling Tower was a maze of glass and steel. Jacob entered the main elevator bay, his mind preoccupied with Emma's upcoming doctor appointment. He pressed the button. He didn't notice that he had stepped into the express executive elevator. The elevator shot upward silently, bypassing dozens of floors. Ding! The doors slid open. Jacob stepped out. The floor was covered in plush, dark gray carpets. There were no signs. The walls were decorated with expensive modern art. He looked at his delivery slip.
Suite 408.
He assumed this must be it. He walked down the long, quiet hallway. At the end stood a pair of massive double doors made of dark oak. There was no secretary at the desk outside. The seat was empty. Jacob hesitated. He knocked gently. No answer. He pushed the door open. "Excuse me, legal department?" he began, his voice echoing in the vast space. But the room was dark. The only illumination came from the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gray city skyline. The blinds were partially drawn. And then Jacob froze. At the far end of the room, behind a desk made of polished marble, sat a woman. She was dressed in a tailored cream suit, her hair pulled back into a perfect, tight bun. On her desk sat a tiny, cheap chocolate cake from a grocery store. The candles had completely melted, leaving colorful wax dripping onto the marble. This was Victoria Sterling. She was 43 years old. She was the absolute ruler of Sterling Industries, one of the most powerful real estate conglomerates in the country. Her face graced the cover of business magazines almost every month. The media called her the Iron Queen of Commerce. She was cold. She was ruthless. She was unstoppable. But right now her eyes were puffy and red. A single tear had tracked through her perfect makeup. She looked up at Jacob. She looked at his delivery uniform. She didn't see the blueprints in his left hand. Her eyes fell immediately upon the metal lunchbox in his right hand. For a split second, a look of raw, childlike hope washed over her face. "Did you actually remember my birthday?" she asked. Her voice, usually sharp and commanding, was barely a whisper. Jacob stood frozen in the doorway. I think I have the wrong room," he stammered, stepping back. "I was looking for suite 408. This is—" Victoria's face shut down instantly. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by her signature cold mask. She wiped her eyes quickly with a silk handkerchief. "This is suite 4800, she said coldly. "Leave. Immediately." Jacob felt a wave of embarrassment wash over him. "I am so sorry, ma'am. I didn't mean to intrude." He began to pull the heavy door shut. But just as he was about to close it, his eyes caught the melted cake again. The sight of this incredibly powerful woman, sitting alone in a dark, empty office on her birthday, struck a chord deep within his chest. He knew what loneliness felt like. He had spent many nights sitting in his dark kitchen, staring at the walls, wishing his wife was there. Jacob stopped. He looked at the blueprints in his hand, then at his lunchbox. He took a slow, deliberate breath and stepped back into the room. "You know," Jacob said softly, his voice warm and gentle, "it is a crime to let a chocolate cake go to waste." Victoria glared at him, her defensive walls rising. "I don't remember hiring a delivery driver to give me life advice. Get out before I call security." Jacob didn't move. Instead, he walked toward the desk. He didn't look threatened. He looked at her with genuine empathy. "I won't stay long," Jacob said, "but my daughter Emma always tells me that no one should ever be alone on their birthday. She says the birthday candles can't make wishes come true if there is no one there to hear them." Victoria looked at him, really looked at him. She saw his tired eyes, his cheap, worn-out uniform, and the absolute lack of fear or greed in his expression. For years, every person who entered this office wanted something from her. Money, contracts, favors. This man wanted nothing. He was just offering kindness. "Who is Emma?" Victoria asked, her voice softening slightly. "My daughter," Jacob smiled, his face lighting up at the mention of her name. "She's 8. She's the boss of our house." Victoria stared at the melted cake. "My secretary went home hours ago," she murmured almost to herself. "My board of directors sent automated emails. My phone has been ringing all day with business partners wishing me a profitable year. But not a single person called to ask if I was okay." She looked up at the vast, empty ceiling. "My mother passed away when I was young. My father died 10 years ago. I sacrificed everything for this company. I built this empire. And yet, I have everything, but I have no one to eat this cake with." Jacob pulled up a modern leather chair. He placed his metal lunchbox on the edge of her pristine marble desk. "Then let's eat," Jacob said. He opened his lunchbox. Inside was a neatly wrapped turkey sandwich, cut into perfect halves, and a small bag of baby carrots. He carefully peeled off the yellow note Emma had written and placed it facing him. Victoria's eyes drifted to the yellow paper. She read the words, "I am so proud of you, Daddy." A sharp pain hit her chest. Her father had been a demanding man. He had pushed her to be the best, to be ruthless, to never show weakness. In his eyes, she was never successful enough. He had never once told her he was proud of her. "Your daughter wrote that?" Victoria asked, her voice trembling. "Yes," Jacob replied, a proud grin on his face. "She writes me a note every day. Even when we only have bread and butter, she makes me feel like the richest man in the world." Victoria looked down at her hands. "I haven't eaten a home-cooked meal in 5 years. I eat at 5-star restaurants, surrounded by people who hate me or fear me. I thought success would make the emptiness go away, but it only made the room larger." Jacob cut his sandwich in half. He offered one half to the multimillionaire CEO. "It's not 5-star, Jacob warned, "but the crusts are cut off. Emma insists on that."
Victoria hesitated.
Then, she reached out and took the sandwich. She took a small bite. It was simple. It tasted of mustard and fresh lettuce. But to her, it tasted like something she hadn't experienced in decades. Tasted like home. Suddenly, Jacob's phone buzzed. It was an old model with a cracked screen. He answered it immediately. "Hey, princess," Jacob said, his voice instantly turning into a gentle, playful tone. The room was so quiet that Victoria could hear the small, sweet voice on the other end of the line. "Daddy, did you eat your lunch? Did you eat the carrots?" "I'm eating them right now, Emma. I promise," Jacob replied, looking at Victoria with a conspiratorial wink. "Good. And Daddy, it's raining outside. Do you have your jacket zipped up? I don't want you to get a cold." "It's zipped all the way to my chin, sweetie. I'll be home in a few hours. I love you. I love you more than all the stars, Daddy. Bye." The call ended. Jacob smiled, his heart full. Victoria watched him. For the first time in her life, she felt a deep envy. Not of his money, for he had none, but of his wealth. He possessed a treasure that all the billions in her bank account could never buy. They sat together for another 20 minutes. They talked about nothing and everything. Jacob told her about his days as an engineer, and Victoria talked about her love for gardening, a hobby she had abandoned 20 years ago. When Jacob finally stood up to leave, the dark sky outside had turned a deep, bruised purple. "Thank you, Jacob," Victoria said. She stood up, her posture returning to its commanding height, but her eyes were different now. They were softer. "Happy birthday, Victoria," Jacob said, holding his blueprints. "I'll make sure to deliver these to the 4th floor now." Before he closed the door, Victoria called out, "Will you be delivering to this building tomorrow?" Jacob paused. He smiled. "Probably. The 4th floor seems to have a lot of paperwork." "Then, maybe I'll see you around," she said. For the first time in years, Victoria looked forward to tomorrow. Over the next 3 weeks, a quiet, unspoken routine developed. Jacob would complete his delivery runs early. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he would take the executive elevator to the 48th floor. Sometimes they only spoke for 5 minutes. Sometimes they shared a cup of black coffee. Jacob learned about the intense pressure Victoria faced from her board of directors. Victoria learned about Emma. She learned about the little girl's brave fight against a faulty heart valve and the mounting medical bills that kept Jacob awake at night. One rainy Tuesday, Victoria sat across from Jacob. She placed a sleek, black leather checkbook on the table. "Jacob," she said, her tone businesslike but her eyes searching his face. "I want to take care of Emma's medical bills. All of them. I can write a check right now. It won't even affect my daily interest." Jacob's posture stiffened. The warmth in his eyes faded slightly. He gently but firmly pushed the checkbook back across the marble desk. "No, Victoria," Jacob said.
Victoria frowned, genuinely confused.
"Why? It's just money. It would save your daughter's life. Why let your pride stand in the way?" "It isn't pride," Jacob said softly. "It's dignity. If I take your charity, our friendship changes. I become a beggar, and you become my patron. I don't want your pity, Victoria. I value your friendship too much. I need an opportunity to earn my way, not a handout." Victoria opened her mouth to argue, but the look of absolute resolve in Jacob's eyes stopped her. She realized, with a shock, that she respected him even more for his refusal. But fate has a cruel way of testing resolve. 2 days later, Jacob was in the middle of a delivery across town when his phone rang. It was Emma's school. "Mr. Miller, you need to come to the hospital immediately. Emma collapsed on the playground. She isn't breathing well." Jacob's world shattered. He dropped his delivery clipboard. He ran to his old, rusted van and tore through the city streets, his heart hammering against his ribs. When he arrived at the pediatric intensive care unit, Emma was pale, hooked up to a maze of monitors and tubes. The doctor met Jacob in the hallway, his face grim. "The valve is failing faster than we anticipated, Mr. Miller. She needs reconstructive heart surgery. We can try to manage it with medication for a few days, but the surgery needs to happen this week." How much?" Jacob's voice cracked. "The specialist, the surgical team, the intensive care. It will be upwards of $150,000. We require a deposit to schedule the private specialist, or we have to put her on the public waiting list, which could take months. She might not have months. Jacob slumped against the cold hospital wall. He covered his face with his rough hands. He felt utterly, completely helpless. He had promised his dying wife he would protect their little girl. And now he was failing. At that exact moment, 40 floors up in the Sterling Tower, a high-stakes board meeting was taking place. Richard Kane, the ambitious vice president of the company, stood at the end of the long conference table. He was a sharp-tongued man of 50, with slicked-back hair and a smile that never reached his eyes. He had been waiting for Victoria to show weakness for years. Over the past month, our CEO has been distracted. Richard projected a slide showing Victoria's calendar. She has been leaving early. She has been canceling meetings with major investors. And security logs show she has been spending hours in her office with a delivery driver. A murmur of disapproval ran through the board members. Victoria sat at the head of the table, her face an unreadable mask of stone. My personal time is my own, Richard. My decisions have not affected our quarterly profits. It's about image, Victoria, Richard snapped. We are about to sign a multi-billion-dollar merger with the Gentech Group. The investors want a leader who is focused, not someone who wastes her time playing savior to the lower class. Suddenly, Victoria's personal phone vibrated on her lap. It was a text from Jacob. It was short. Emma is in the hospital. The valve failed. I don't know what to do. Victoria felt a cold spike of panic. She stood up immediately. This meeting is adjourned, she announced. Richard gasped. Adjourned? Victoria, the Gentech representatives are arriving in 30 minutes. If you walk out now, you risk losing the merger. You risk your position as CEO. Victoria looked at Richard. She looked at the greedy, cold faces of the board members. For 30 years, she had believed that this room was the center of the universe. Now she saw it for what it was. A cold, lifeless cage. Some things are more important than mergers, Richard, Victoria said, her voice ringing with absolute authority. And if this board wants to fire me for remembering what it means to be human, then go ahead. She turned and walked out, leaving the room in stunned silence. When Victoria arrived at the hospital, she found Jacob sitting on the floor of the hallway, his head between his knees. He was shaking. She knelt down beside him. She didn't care about her expensive cream suit touching the dirty hospital floor. She placed a hand on his shoulder. Jacob, she whispered. Jacob looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, filled with tears. I promised Sarah, he sobbed. I promised her I would save our baby. But I can't. I don't have the money. I don't have anything. Victoria squeezed his shoulder. Listen to me, Jacob. I am not going to give you a handout, because I know you, but I am going to tell you a secret. She looked down, her own eyes filling with tears. 30 years ago, I had a younger brother. His name was Leo. He was born with a weak heart. My father and I were so busy building this company, so busy chasing the next contract, that we didn't notice how tired he was getting. We missed his doctor appointments because of critical board meetings. One day, his heart just stopped. She looked back at Jacob, her voice cracking. That is the real reason I was alone on my birthday. I let my family die for a corporate title. Cannot change my past, Jacob, but I can change Emma's future. Let me help you, not as a billionaire, but as a sister who wants to save a brother. She didn't offer a check. Instead, she said, our engineering subsidiary, Sterling Tech, has been looking for a chief mechanical consultant. The salary is $180,000 a year, with full, immediate family medical coverage. The position starts today. I have the contract in my bag. You are qualified, Jacob. You always have been. Will you take the job? Jacob looked at her. He saw no pity in her eyes, only a deep, pleading desire to do something right, to heal a 30-year-old wound. He wiped his tears. He stood up, pulling her up with him. I'll start immediately, Jacob said. Within 2 hours, Emma was admitted to the VIP surgical wing. The best pediatric cardiologist in the state, a close personal friend of Victoria, was prepped for surgery. The battle was won, but the healing had just begun. The waiting room of the pediatric surgical wing was quiet. The tick of the wall clock seemed to echo with agonizing slowness. Jacob sat in one of the vinyl chairs, his hands clasped tightly, his eyes fixed on the double doors of the operating room. Victoria sat beside him. She had ignored 36 urgent phone calls from her assistant. She had turned off her work phone entirely. For the first time in her career, the stock market could rise or fall without her care. After 5 long hours, the red light above the operating doors turned green. The surgeon stepped out, pulling down his mask. He looked tired, but a warm smile broke across his face. The surgery was a complete success, the doctor said. The new valve is working perfectly. Her heart is strong, Jacob. She's a fighter. Jacob let out a breath he felt he had been holding for 5 years. He sank back into his chair, tears of pure relief streaming down his face. Victoria let out a shaky breath, placing her hand over her own heart. 2 weeks later, Emma was allowed to return home. The transformation in their small apartment was immediate. Jacob had started his new role at Sterling Tech. He spent his mornings designing high-precision components for medical equipment, work that felt incredibly meaningful to him. He was paid what he was worth. The shadow of financial ruin had finally lifted from his shoulders. But the biggest change was in Victoria. The Iron Queen began to melt. She started delegating her workload. She hired an assistant whose sole job was to ensure she left the office by 5 o'clock every afternoon. She established the Leo Sterling Heart Foundation, dedicating a massive portion of her personal wealth to funding cardiac surgeries for children from low-income families. One sunny Saturday afternoon, Victoria's luxury sedan pulled up outside Jacob's modest apartment building. She was dressed in casual jeans and a simple cotton sweater, clothing she hadn't worn in 20 years. She carried a grocery bag filled with flour, sugar, and chocolate chips. When she knocked on the door, Emma opened it. The little girl's cheeks were rosy, her eyes bright with life. "Victoria!" Emma squealed, throwing her arms around the older woman's waist. Victoria hugged her back tightly, a genuine, radiant smile spreading across her face.
Suatia.
"Are you ready to make a mess in the kitchen?" "Yes. Daddy already burned the first batch of cookies." Emma giggled, pulling Victoria inside. The afternoon was filled with laughter, flower fights, and the warm, sweet smell of baking cookies. Jacob watched them from the kitchen doorway, his heart full. He saw Victoria laughing. Not the polite, strained laugh she used for business associates, but a deep, belly laugh that made her eyes crinkle. As they sat around the small wooden dining table, eating warm chocolate chip cookies, Emma looked up at Victoria. "Victoria," Emma asked, her voice innocent and curious. "Why were you always alone before you met my daddy?" The room fell into a sudden, quiet stillness. Jacob looked at Victoria, wondering how she would answer. Victoria set her cookie down. She looked at Emma's bright, healthy face, and then at Jacob's warm, supportive eyes. "Well, Emma," Victoria said softly, "because I thought that if I worked really hard and built really big buildings, I wouldn't need anyone else. I thought that being powerful meant I wouldn't ever have to feel sad or scared." "But that sounds lonely," Emma said, tilting her head. "It was," Victoria admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "It was very lonely." Emma slid off her chair and walked over to Victoria. She climbed into her lap, wrapping her small, flour-dusted arms around Victoria's neck. "Well, you don't have to be lonely anymore," Emma whispered, "because you're part of our family now, and no one should ever have to eat their birthday cake alone." A single tear slipped down Victoria's cheek, but this time, she didn't wipe it away. She simply held the little girl tighter, feeling, for the first time in her life, the true warmth of a home. 6 months passed. It was a crisp autumn evening. The grand ballroom of the city's cultural center was bathed in warm, golden light. Tonight was the official launch gala of the Leo and Emma Heart Foundation. The room was filled with hundreds of guests. Doctors, philanthropists, and families whose children had already been helped by the foundation's early grants. Jacob stood near the entrance, looking handsome in a simple but well-fitted charcoal suit. Emma stood beside him, wearing a bright yellow dress with a matching ribbon in her hair. She was holding a small, beautifully wrapped cardboard box. Victoria approached them, looking stunning in a deep emerald green gown. She looked younger, lighter. The cold, severe look that had once defined her had completely vanished, replaced by a soft, approachable elegance. "You both look incredible," Victoria smiled, her eyes lingering on Jacob. "We learned from the best," Jacob replied, his voice low and warm. Emma stepped forward, holding up the box. "This is for you, Victoria. You have to open it now, before the speeches start." Victoria knelt down to Emma's eye level. "For me? What is it?" She carefully untied the ribbon and opened the lid. Inside was a simple, homemade white candle, hand-painted with little yellow suns. Next to it was a small, hand-drawn card. The card read, "To Victoria, to make sure you never have to blow out a candle alone again. Happy early birthday. Love, Emma." Victoria felt a familiar tightness in her throat, but it was no longer a pain of sadness. It was a tightness of overwhelming gratitude. She looked up at Jacob, her eyes shining. "Thank you," she whispered. Jacob reached down and gently took her hand, helping her stand up. "I built an empire, Jacob," Victoria said, her voice trembling slightly as she looked around the crowded ballroom. "I spent 40 years building walls of concrete and glass. But it took a tired delivery driver and an 8-year-old girl with a broken heart to teach me what a real home is." Jacob smiled, his thumb gently tracing the back of her hand. "Sometimes," Jacob said softly, "we have to walk through the wrong door to find the place we truly belong." Later that night, as the music played softly in the background, the three of them stood together near the balcony, looking out at the city lights. There were no boardrooms. There were no cold corporate contracts. There was only a father, a daughter, and a woman who had finally found her family. In this world, we are taught that success is measured by the height of our offices, the size of our bank accounts, or the number of people who work beneath us. But true success is much simpler. True success is having at least one person who remembers to ask if you have eaten your lunch. It is having one person who cares if your jacket is zipped against the cold. And sometimes, the greatest miracle of your life doesn't start with a perfect plan. It starts with a wrong elevator and a door opened by mistake.